Cardboard Houses, an exploration of gender, selfhood, and violence in Rebecca and a Wide Sargasso Sea. In the study of the Gothic this semester, I've explored how a barrier, a locked door, a hidden vault, an unentered room, operates in a novel as both a physical deterrent for a character and a metaphor for the barricaded spaces of a woman's interior life. In Rebecca and Wide Sargasso Sea, the attic of Thornfield and the boathouse of Manderley function as places in which the female protagonists can take on a room of their own, respectively, but both of these spaces become the character's undoing. In the attic at Thornfield, Antoinette is only allowed to speak with Grace Poole, and without any windows or mirrors, she loses all sense of reality and herself. In the boathouse, Rebecca is free to express herself outside both Maxim and society's expectations of the mistress of Manderley. In their deaths, however, the protagonist's autonomy switches. Rebecca is shot by Maxim while Antoinette escapes and subsequently kills herself. These women are both given a room of their own, but this gift becomes another tool for the men in their lives to imprison them. In this paper, I will be discussing how each of these texts toy with the idea of a room of one's own that Virginia Woolf presented in her 1929 long-form essay of the same name. Woolf writes, "A woman must have money and a room of her own if she wishes to write fiction. I wish to broaden the concept of writing fiction to a woman's perceived ability to function freely in her own space. This argument is to not refute Woolf's ideas, but rather track how persuasively a male oppressor controls feminine spaces, regardless of the woman's own autonomy." The converted boathouse in Rebecca is both a space of gendered violence and a space of non-gendered freedom. In her physical conversion of the boathouse to the cottage, Rebecca was allowed to reclaim a room of her own outside both Maxim's explicit control and the stifling expectations of a mistress of Manderley. In the converted boathouse, the assumptions of Rebecca's gender seem to slip away. Although the reader is never able to hear Rebecca in her own narrative voice, Maxim's descriptions reveal Rebecca's perceived freedom in the cottage and her tendency to escape there when her obligations at Manderley become too much. When Mrs. De Winter first entered the boathouse, she described it as having a queer, musty smell. When Maxim recalls the night at the boathouse when he killed Rebecca, he describes her as ill, queer, and remarks, "She looked like a boy in her sailing kit, a boy with the face of a Botticelli angel." Here, the boathouse codes explicitly outside of heteronormative constraints. Although the word queer was not as closely tied with homosexuality or alternate gender identity in 1938 as it is today, it still works to mark the boathouse as distinctly othered, regardless of implications of sex or gender. For Rebecca, the boathouse was a respite from the rest of the world, but for Maxim, however, the boathouse was a reminder of Rebecca's independence, the possibility of her life without his, one that did not fall neatly into his perfect trifecta of breeding, brains, and beauty. So he killed her. The room of her own quickly soured into a place of haunting and harm, somewhere that no matter how hard she tried to escape it, she was at the mercy of the men in her life, particularly those with a gun. In Wide Sargasso Sea, Antoinette's relationship with freedom and gendered space is almost entirely inverse. When Antoinette revives at Thornfield, the point of view returns to her perspective, and the prose is haunting, almost dreamlike. Antoinette begins to have visions of her mother as a ghostly figure who is no longer there. Looking at the tapestry one day, I recognized my mother dressed in an evening gown but with bare feet. She looked away from me, over my head as she used to do. Since there is no mirror in her attic prison, Antoinette forgets herself. At night, when Grace Poole sleeps, Antoinette sneaks out of the locked room and remarks, "I think that we've changed course and lost our way to England. This cardboard house where I walk at night is not England." In her breaking out and returning to the attic, Antoinette loses any sense of time and self completely, therefore thwarting any agency she could possibly have. On the night of her last escape, Antoinette throws away the candle on the second floor and remarks, "Then I turned round and saw the sky. It was red and all my life was in it." The book ends with Antoinette narrating her path to freedom. It, the fire, burned up again to light me along the dark passage. By setting Thornfield on fire, Antoinette is able to take her imprisonment back into her own hands. Unlike Rebecca, her freedom lies outside the locked door, meant to keep her in rather than keep others out. Antoinette and Rebecca's paths toward autonomous spaces are directly inverse. In The Care of Rochester, Antoinette is trapped in the attic, and though it could function as a room of her own, it is only through her own suicide that Antoinette escapes. On the other hand, Rebecca finds a sense of freedom in the converted boathouse, until her husband kills her for it. What I found particularly interesting, and became my inspiration for the images I chose to accompany this essay, was the relationship Rebecca and Antoinette's agency and their ability to physically view or describe their own bodies. Since Rebecca is told in the form of a flashback, with the narrator only getting snippets of Rebecca's life through Maxim or Mrs. Danvers, Rebecca is unable to assert herself. In White Sargasso Sea, Antoinette has no mirrors in her attic prison, therefore is unable to articulate her sense of self. In my visual accompaniment to this paper, I used portraits of queer and Caribbean women by Jamaican artist Camille Chetta to allow the real Rebecca and Antoinette to take shape and form before me, stepping from her shadow world like a living figure from a picture frame. In both books, the characters' rooms of their own became their liberation and their downfall. In both cases, a male oppressor sought control, but both women found their own way to agency inside and outside of the locked doors, regardless of the consequences.